Hi, my name is Steve Ward. I'm a pre-sales consultant working for Emerson, and in this session I'm going to take you through the cybersecurity aspects of PACSystems and Movicon. We'll be focusing on PACSystems, and the reason is that PACSystems is a PLC controller including CPUs, communication modules, I/O modules and other networking capabilities, whereas Movicon is software. And with Movicon, because it's software, it's relying greatly on the underlying aspects of the operating system. Having said that, Movicon does have some cybersecurity enhancements for users and user management, whereas with PACSystems, there's a lot more involvement, and that's also will be covered by the Cyber Resilience Act. But both applications and both brand names, they are covered by the IEC 62443 standard as well. Now, security is a long-standing factor in industrial automation. It's always been there, but I think what we've seen is since 2017, and with an increasing number of cyber attacks, there was a turning point for the industry and additional cybersecurity protection became required. It's also affected by many systems now are increasingly connected to the internet, whereas in the past it was quite possible that a machine or application or process would be isolated. So security covers many aspects. The simplest is physical security. If you wanted a denial of service attack, you have a simple ways to open up the PLC cabinet, remove power to the PLC, or maybe unplug a module. Of course, you'd need to be physically located next to the PLC to be able to do this, but that physical security still remains one of the most important aspects of cybersecurity. So for that, you need aspects like physical locks on control cabinets and doors. You need specified access to the operations and control rooms. You need potentially fences with secure access points for your facilities. And that could extend all the way up to security guards and patrols to decide who is allowed to go where. Now, when systems started becoming connected to the internet, there was this whole idea about air gapping. And initially, systems were physically separated between control systems and outside communications infrastructure. But increasingly, that digital air gap has gone. There was a concept of so-called digital diodes, which would only pass data in one direction. But those digital diodes don't really make sense, because if you look at most communication protocols like TCP/IP, they require dual-way communication, because you send a message that has to be acknowledged, you then have to acknowledge the acknowledgement and so on, and it's not really feasible for a pure digital diode to exist. You could create a device which has TCP connections in one direction and TCP communications in another direction, but then that digital diode itself becomes a point of attack. So digital diodes make limited sense. You need much more in terms of security. And this is where continuous security improvement became a thing, and it continues to be a thing. Security is a moving target. Organizations must be adept at implementing all latest mitigations to minimize exposure, and they must do quickly, because there is an opportunity for attack, so-called zero-day attacks, which can happen very quickly, and a small window there is opened, but once a system is compromised, then turning the tide back can be very difficult to uncompromise that system. So there's a whole load of things going on with security, and I'm going to cover some of these aspects as we go through this deck. So this is Emerson's view of what a cohesive operational technology vendor cybersecurity strategy looks like. Now, this isn't necessarily everything. I'll cover IEC 62443 in a bit more detail later. There are lots of things that are the responsibility of the system integrator or the OEM, as well as the end user. But overall, the OT vendor does have some responsibilities. So we start off with the platform and supply chain. The cybersecurity process demands that there is a secure development process, including training, vendor management, and the vendor risk management process. All this applies before you even start developing or implementing hardware. Above this, you need some sort of root of trust and protected boot. And we can implement this using trusted platform modules, and that's implemented on our latest controllers. The trusted platform module is effectively a silicon or piece of silicon either soldered onto the root of the board of the CPU, or these days perhaps even embedded into the CPU. but it does need to be separate technology. It's not a software solution, it is a hardware solution. And what the TPM does is it stores things like certificates, and it stores other validation mechanisms which allow PKI security, public key infrastructure security, and certificates. And that trusted platform module has to be secure and mounted on the board so that it becomes very difficult to compromise. The next thing we can do is implement secure boot. Secure boot on the controllers allows the whole boot process to be monitored, and that allows us to make sure that we're only running processes which are approved by the vendor. And that relies on those certificates and passwords and other aspects which are contained inside the TPM, and they ensure part of that security. Above the level of secure boot, we then need trusted operating systems and hypervisors. So with Emerson, we use certified firmware images, we use secure firmware upgrades, and the controllers include a firewall, and the operating system and the hypervisors themselves, they come from vendors which themselves have that platform and supply chain security and can provide that level of certificates and so on, which are enabled by these other underlying layers. We need secure communications. So we have Achilles certified controllers, which are secured against a variety of different attacks, particularly denial of service attacks. For secure communications between devices, we use OPCUA secure communications, and we can also use techniques like network port throttling so that a denial of service attack cannot have any effectiveness. You then need secure services. This includes a secure deployment guide, and we have these secure deployment guides for every product, including PCert group for managing security reports, as well as lots of other ways of notifying Emerson that there is a security issue. We then need to make sure that the application itself can be secured, and this is normally implemented using password protected access control, and those passwords are encrypted. They're not stored in plain text, and with the CPUs and with most of our network modules, we also have a built-in software-based firewall as well. And then on top of all of this, we perform regular security assessments. This includes comprehensive penetration testing, including white, grey and black box testing, and that occurs throughout the product lifecycle. Now the key point here is no single security technology is a silver bullet. Security must be built into all layers, and another aspect is security isn't static. You can't have a system that's secure and will potentially be secure forever. There are always potential issues or bugs which might expose the system in future. So there needs to be a way of making sure that the system can be maintained and upgraded in future and not just secured from day one. Another aspect of this is what we call defense in depth, and this is again where there's no single security technology. Security must be built into all those different layers, and that's called that defense in depth type approach. So let's delve into these in a bit more detail, starting with secure by design for dynamic hardware solutions. And this is all about securing the controller, which is the first step in the security strategy. So there are several objectives here. The first objective is tamper-resistant security built directly into the platform, and we achieve that using a trusted platform module. A trusted platform module is a separate piece of silicon that manages cryptographic keys and cryptographic operations. And because it's separate, it means it can't easily be tampered with. Because it's not a software solution, it can't easily be compromised. The idea is all of the security keys are actually held within that trusted platform module on the device itself. Now you need to have confidence that the firmware being executed has not been modified or tampered with, and this is where secure boot comes in. So firmware is digitally signed and verified on backup. An unauthorized firmware is prevented from running, and that relies on that TPM in order to be implemented. We also use concepts like measured or timed boot, and we can record startup securely in the TPM for later attestation to make sure that the system is actually running as intended and has not been modified or tampered with. Now, because there might be bugs or feature enhancements or cybersecurity fixes later in the life of the product, the user needs to know that firmware updates that are applied are built and verified correctly. And this is where we have a secure firmware update process. So firmware updates are prohibited when the controller is in run mode, and mode changes can be password protected. So you can authorize particular users to be able to change the controller state, but other users will not be able to perform that. And remember, those passwords are also encrypted themselves. We don't record passwords in plain text. And also the passwords are set by the user. They're not predefined passwords. They're not known by Emerson. They can't be hacked by Emerson or cracked by Emerson. They are the responsibility of the end user who can manage those passwords. Now, when the firmware update is performed, any firmware update attempts will be rejected if the firmware is not digitally signed with an Emerson certificate. So there are various ways of doing that, including hashes and the certificates themselves. And if it's not an official certificate, then the firmware will not be able to be updated. So that prevents various root type attacks on the actual controllers themselves. Now, the next aspect of secure by design is hardening of the controller. Securing the controller is the first step in the security strategy. And this is the next layer on top of the previous slide's options. So more objectives. The first is to reduce the attack surface available to would-be attackers. The idea there is that the more ports are open, the more possibility there is for an attacker to gain access to the system. So what we do is we have communication port protection, and we can disable all unused ports in the operating system, making it difficult for attackers to identify potential attack vectors. And when we say ports, that includes both physical ports and also Ethernet IP type ports as well. So there are very few ports that are open, and the ones that are open can be protected. Now, another objective is to ride through attacks until excess network traffic is resolved. This is a common issue in broadcast storms and with denial of service type attacks. So what we do for this is we have communications ingress and egress throttling. So this helps us to detect and manage those denial of service or distributed denial of service attacks. And we also have alerts to operators that a security attack may be occurring via various faults and logs that are built into the system. And this is where monitoring suspicious activity comes in. So we have security audits, including logging of last user access by username, and we record both success and failures. And we can also record last access and last update information so that the user can be sure who last had access to the system and what actions were performed on the system. Now, it's possible that a PLC system may operate by itself, but in most applications there is some sort of communication with other devices. So we need to secure communications, and this is the important second step in the security strategy. So we implement secure messaging. Now, not every message protocol can be secured. Modbus TCP, for example, there are secure extensions, but they're not implemented by most vendors. So Modbus TCP is generally insecure. There are various vendor specific protocols, some of which have more security than others, but many are open. And there are also I/O protocols. I/O is normally outside the scope of these secure communications because this would normally be on a separate network. And the issue with I/O communications is we do need high performance, and with small embedded devices, performance versus security can be a big trade-off to the extent where it might be impossible to do so using the small micro type controllers that I/O type devices work. But when it comes to peer-to-peer communications and between PLCs and HMI SCADA and upper level systems, then there is a requirement to implement secure messaging. So the way we do this is OPCUA with certificates. Certificates can be used both for signing and for encrypting messages. So certificates, they perform the function of identifying the communicating parties, and the concept there is that each trusted application can communicate with other trusted applications, but any messages without a certificate can be ignored. So that verifies that you're only talking to trusted parties. Now, those certificates, they can be individually signed on each machine, but they can also be uploaded to various certificate stores, and they can also be coordinated with certificate authorities, going all the way up to high levels of trust for organizations. So it's possible to have very high levels of security for signing messages. The other aspect of OPCUA certificates is to allow encryption of the messages, ensuring that only those communicating parties can read the message content. and this uses asymmetric public key infrastructure. So there are different encryption keys. One encryption key is used to encode the message, another encryption key is used to decode the message, and both parties need their relevant keys in order to be able to send messages to each other. And the important thing there is that no one on the network can read that message while it's in transit. They would just see an encrypted message which would be complete garbage and impossible to read. So OPCUA, very important protocol for OT technology, operational technology, to allow us to sign and encrypt those messages. Now, whilst we might have physical secure access to the controller, we also need to be able to secure access to the controller over the various protocols and using the various networks. So a variety of objectives here. First objective is to secure the application and intellectual property from unauthorized access. So different people, whether you're an OEM or end user or system integrator, may have different requirements around intellectual property and securing the application. But ultimately, what we do to help authorized access only, we have multiple password protected levels of access with increasing privileges. So there are 4 main levels. 1 is read only, 2 is read and write under limited circumstances, 3 gives you slightly more access, and then 4 is like a full administrator with full privileges for read and write and change the mode. And you can give different users different password levels in order to allow them to perform some functions but not others. Again, it's important to note those passwords, they are not hard-coded, there are no default passwords, they all have to be implemented by the user using their own password policy. And we also support auditing of user access and of updates to know when passwords are changed and when people actually access the system. As well as authorizing access at the higher level of the CPU, we can also authorize individual access to function blocks as well. So within the PLC code, if there is a piece of, say, analytical routine that you want to protect, you can separately protect that either from being viewed or from being read, and that can either be password protected or it can be permanently locked. So there are options there as well for additionally protecting intellectual property if you're an OEM and you have some proprietary routines. We can also determine exactly what information is shared. So we can selectively secure data in the CPU by configuring access to memory areas and variables using external clients and programming tools. So the way that's done is there are access lists, and for each variable you can set whether it is published and whether it can be viewed or not, and whether it can be read to or whether it's read and write. And the same is supported by memory areas. So the traditional PLC data table areas, they can be protected as well in that same way. And we can prevent man-in-the-middle attacks. So again, passwords are encrypted. This enables users to set complex passwords, and we're using Secure Remote Password Protocol, SPR6A. This is a new class of strong authentication protocols that resist passive and active attacks over the network. So even if a user was on the network and was able to read the passwords as they were going across the network, those passwords themselves would actually be secured and users would not be able to reverse encode those passwords and they would not be able to perform any attacks. So all of this about securing the access to the controller application, this is this important third step in the security strategy. So Emerson also has secure by design using a secure development process, and this is actually approved to IAC 62443-4-1. And there's a variety of different functions we have under this secure development process. This includes security assessments, including comprehensive penetration testing with white, grey and black box testing throughout product lifecycle. We have secure deployment guides. Those secure deployment guides give information to the users about how to create hierarchies and how to protect those hierarchies. Again, if you consider defense in depth, you have at a very low level, you've got your process control zone, and you may have multiple process control zones. Above that, you may have peer-to-peer comms. You may then have manufacturing operations and supervisory control. then a so-called DMZ or DMZ, which is your demilitarized zone, and then above that your business applications and servers, and arguably above that access to your cloud or your wide area networks for enterprise access. So all of those layers are individual layers. They need to be defended individually with multiple firewalls and maybe intrusion detection systems and intrusion protection systems, and some of those are out of Emerson's scope. So we're focusing down at the process control layer and also the peer-to-peer and the PLC to HMI SCADA layer. Above that, then that generally becomes more of an IT function, the information technology function, rather than the OT function. So what the secure deployments cover, they include concepts around network architectures, they include details of what the requirements for protocols are, they include authentication and authorization strategies, details of how to manage passwords, information about logging and auditing, and strategies for update management. Now, many of these are, again, outside the scope of what Emerson can actually do on an operational point of view, but we provide the guidelines and the underlying hardware and software capabilities in order to allow people to manage the systems in the way that they need to. So again, for example, a simple example, password management. We support complex passwords, but it's up to the end user to decide what that complex password looks like. You know, how many characters it is, how many upper and lower case, how many numbers, how many special characters. We don't enforce that. That's up to the end user to decide that password management process. Now, above this, there is a process to promptly record computer security incidents and notify users. And for that one, we're reporting to the CERT group, and they have the capability to notify any users of any issues. So you can sign up to these security notifications, and then as soon as a firmware fix is available, that allows you to apply that fix in order to be able to resolve that particular cybersecurity issue. So here's a copy of our certificate for our secure development process. We are fully approved under IEC 62443-4-1 for our secure development lifecycle process. And this particular process here, this applies to our Charlottesville Design Centre, and we have similar certificates for other products and other offices. So there are various cybersecurity standards that apply. The key one is IEC 62443, and this is a series of standards that address security for operational technology in automation and control systems. Now, as we said, we have IEC 62443 for secure supply chain, and then within our main products such as PACSystems, PAC Machine Edition programming software, and Movicon HMI SCADA software, we have IEC 62443 certification for the actual secure products themselves. We also have the upcoming Cyber Resilience Act. This is a European standard due to come into effect at the end of 2027. And we already comply with many aspects of the CRA. And what we will be doing is we'll be implementing as required and maintaining compliance as per CE mark laws and standards, mainly focusing on the IEC 62443 series of standards. We also have support to implement ISO 27001, the NIST security framework or CSF, NIST, NIST2, etc. All of those may be implemented by the end user, and Emerson supports these standards initiatives with product features and approvals, and if necessary we can provide consultancy to help the users actually comply with these standards. So we talked about IEC 62443. IEC 62443 is a group of certifications. While all of them apply to the end user system, many of them do not actually apply to PACSystems and Movicon. For example, we already mentioned a password policy. We allow you to implement passwords, but it's up to the end user to decide what their password policy is. We also talked about physical security. It's up to the end user to actually implement what that physical security might look like. There might be other issues such as user training, such as the way you define your network architecture. All of those are requirements at the end user level, where we're really focusing down at the component level. So what we're looking at is IEC 62443-4-1, which we have, and then we're looking at some of the technical security requirements for components as well as some of the system security requirements and security levels. And here's a bit more detail about where we are with 62443 implementation. So we are adopting a phased approach to full IEC 62443 compliance, as that will apply to us and it's mandated under the CRA. A lot of work is completed and we're expecting certificates to be released soon. And as I mentioned, some of these we already have. So the 62443-4.1 we have. For Movicon, we also have 62443-3-3. And for PACSystems, there will be a similar set of certificates, again, mainly around the 62443-3-3. And the idea is we have this phased, secure approach. Some of it's complete, individual product certifications coming soon. And then the phase 3 is all about secure product integration. But again, if you look at those, there's only about 3 of those in green which actually apply to Emerson. Many of them, such as the system, the policies, the procedures, and of course the general layer, either compliance does not apply because terminology, for example, and concepts and models is not a compliance issue, it's a definition issue. But for many of these, they are, again, focused on the end user. But Emerson is committed to achieving all of the relevant parts of IEC 62443 according to what the user would need from the actual product vendor. So we are working hard on that for the ones that we don't have currently. And we have been working on 62443 in the CRA for many years now. So there's going to be no issue in actually implementing them. In many cases, we're effectively already there in terms of the product capabilities. It may be just it's the certificates which will need to follow through. So here are some guidelines for cybersecurity responsibilities for the end user themselves. Again, it's not possible for Emerson to do all of this because many of these aspects are out of our scope. And if it's an OEM that's providing machinery, or if it's a system integrator that's implementing products, a lot of these aspects are outside of those people as well. These are mainly end user responsibilities. So my suggestion is to first of all perform assessment and risk analysis and understand what are your risks, what is exposed, what might happen, and based on this you can set your priorities and then you can implement a cybersecurity policy including whatever your incident response policy needs to be. Now you will need to implement physical security, and what you'll also need is a security administrator or a security team that can actually be responsible for cybersecurity. You'll then need to perform user training and you'll need to manage those users. So that includes thinking about roles and access levels. It includes that password policy we mentioned, and it includes any other procedures there might be. Now, you do need to implement security at the network level itself. So this is where things like firewalls, virtual LANs, secure protocols, they all come in to actually implement security at the network level. And then on an ongoing basis, you need to monitor for potential intrusion and attacks. So that includes monitoring logs and audit trails. And most likely these days, you'd also be using an IDS or an IPS to detect attacks and to prevent attacks and potentially to shut down the network or do whatever else is required in order to fend off those attacks. Here are some more detailed recommendations for PLCs and HMI SCADA. So I recommend taking backups and securing them, making sure that they can't be modified or overwritten, or as a simple denial of service attack, making sure they're not deleted. So taking backups and securing them, that allows fast recovery, and you should be doing this anyway besides cybersecurity, but cybersecurity makes this even more important. You do need to manage and secure access by implementing passwords. So based on your password policy, you will define what those passwords will look like, and then somebody will need to implement those and potentially store them in a secure location. Depending on what your PLCs are doing and what they're connected to, and the same with HMI SCADA, you might need to disable unused ports and protocols. So for example, if there are FTP servers which aren't being used, you turn those off, assuming they're enabled in the first place. You might also want to disable USB ports. So again, there's multiple things that you might do based on, again, what does your risk assessment say and what does your cybersecurity policy say. If there's legacy equipment, you might want to secure that using special techniques. Maybe you need a firewall, maybe you need complete physical segregation, or maybe legacy equipment needs to be replaced. Yeah, there's only so long that equipment can be upgraded for. And even under the CRA, which is talking about 5 years of support after the product is released, once the 5 years is gone by, then again that equipment becomes legacy, and then you might need to look at replace it because there might not be any cybersecurity mitigations available. If there are legacy and insecure protocols, they can be upgraded or replaced with secure protocols. And again, this is where OPC-UA with certificates for signing and encryption comes in. Other protocols could include MQTT, which can be secured. And if you can't secure the actual protocol itself, you could consider wrapping the protocol up inside a virtual private network or VPN to make sure that no one can interfere with or read that data. You can also allow access only to required data by setting up the network configuration inside the controller to say what are the access ports, what's read only, what's read and write, and so on. And if there are any I/O networks, they need to be secured. So ideally, I/O networks will be completely segregated, and that's a good reason from an operational point of view as well, to enable them to run at full speed. But also for security, again, isolating them means that they cannot be hacked. And then you would continually monitor access logs and fault tables for potential intrusion and attacks. That can also be implemented partly by putting alarms into the HMI SCADA. And what you'd also need to do is monitor our customer center for any cybersecurity notifications, and then to take and update any appropriate firmware. So in summary, there's no simple fix. You can't apply a simple device and expect that to have you protected forever. There's no done and dusted. What you need to do is you need defense in depth, and that requires a strategy. And the user must continually monitor their environment, monitor their practices and policies, make sure the installed equipment is okay, and that all has to be modified or updated as required. And it's a continual process. Yeah, there's never going to be an end to cybersecurity. This is going to become, or already is, another part of operating plants. So cybersecurity becomes like many other IT type functions. So, managing your servers, managing your networks, managing cybersecurity, that's part of your IT functions and overlapping into the OT functions. But the good news is, from our point of view, Emerson, PACSystems and Movicon do provide many OT cybersecurity capabilities that do allow you to securely implement these OT systems. So that completes the main part of the slide deck. I do have some additional backup notes here, so I'm going to go through these now, but you don't have to listen to these unless you need to know a bit more about some of the things we've already said and want to know a bit more about the sorts of things that might happen in terms of cybersecurity issues and risks. Now, one aspect about OPC-UA is managing certificates is hard work. In general, a certificate is a file, and the way you handle that file is by physically copying that file from one location to another, either moving the file around manually over a network or copying it to some sort of secure device. But now you have a security risk because you might have a USB port that's open. So certificate management can be complicated, and also it's more of an IT function. Typically, OT engineers are not familiar with managing OPC-UA certificates. So to help, Emerson has introduced our PAC Security Center, and this is specifically designed for managing OPC-UA certificates. It lets you easily deploy and manage OPC-UA security, and compared to doing things manually, we expect you can improve your efficiency on configuring the entire system by greater than 50%. It also reduces downtime by supporting rapid recovery from a single node with a single click, so it makes recovery very fast as well. And there are also troubleshooting tools to facilitate finding security configuration problems. Now, it's based on a PAC Security Console, and this is an intuitive administrator console that connects to the PAC Security Server. The PAC Security Server securely contains all of the certificates, and the PAC Security Console allows you to register those security certificates and manage those security certificates. So that includes securing them in a secure location, it includes copying them to the right locations, And it even includes revoking certificates, so that, for example, if you change a CPU, or if a user leaves, or if a node is decommissioned, then you can manage that revocation of those certificates. So it includes various server managements for the certificates, registration, discovery, and certificate management services, and all of this simplifies this OPCUA certificate management for non-IT type users. Now, pending full IEC 62443 certification, Emerson already has certifications for secure communications. We work with the WorldTech Achilles communication certifications, and what we do is, with the WorldTech Achilles tests, we verified our network stack robustness. So this includes monitoring specific behavioral and performance indicators while the controller is subject to network attacks to make sure that the controller actually functions correctly. This includes grammar attacks, it includes network storms, and it includes known vulnerabilities for particular types of stacks. There are really two certification levels. Level 1 is an established industry benchmark, which is about the deployment of robust industrial devices, and this is recognized by most major automation vendors and operators. And Level 2 is an expansion of Level 1, which includes additional certification by employing more tests and more pass-fail requirements. Now, WorldTech is important. The reason is the tests that are performed guarantee that the CPU is able to continue operating under all these different types of network attacks. I have seen non-Achilles type products which, subject to an attack, effectively fail. Either the PLC scan time gets really high, or maybe the PLC crashes, or in some cases it's actually possible to compromise the PLC in other ways and make it perform actions that it's not intended to do. So the whole idea of Achilles communication certifications is to guarantee that the controller is immune to these variety of different attacks. Now, we talked about certificates. Certificates are based on public key infrastructure security. And PKI, what that security does is it uses these shared security keys to sign and encrypt messages. It's based on very complex mathematics, and it's not easy to understand, but fundamentally it involves these security keys, which are files of lengths of bytes, and these security keys are used to sign and encrypt these messages. So there's cryptographic technology underneath, but it also relies on simple file transfer to actually share the keys. So first of all, there is a private key. The private key is used by the sender to sign and encrypt the message being sent. No one else has access to the private key other than that sender. What the receiver does is, the receiver uses the sender's public key to confirm the message sender's identity and to decrypt the message. So because the receiver only has the public key and not the private key, they can receive a message, but they cannot pretend to be the sender. They can only receive those messages and decrypt them. And although it's called a public key, that public key can only be distributed to certain people, and that can restrict who is actually able to decrypt the message. So private keys are held by the sender only, and public keys are shared with the required recipients only. And what you can do is, if you're a sender or receiver, you can block messages if someone isn't using that public key. So that public key, as well as another layer, that can also be certificated using a higher level authority. So it's very involved in terms of what's possible, but it comes down to this private key and public key information. Now, the certificates are used to transfer and store keys securely, and certificates themselves have a validity time and they expire after this. Now, this is actually a challenge for OT applications because a typical certificate validity is 5 years, and at the end of that 5 years you would have to issue and manage a new set of certificates. But to simplify that, some devices, including Emerson, can be considered or configured to ignore that validity time, because there is a risk that suddenly after 5 years all your communications will halt and your plant will shut down. If you don't want to worry about the expiry time, then you can disable that, but it is now introducing a potential security risk. But the other option is certificates can be revoked. I mentioned this. For example, if a device or user is no longer in use, you can revoke their certificate, And then even if a device receives that certificate, then that certificate can be ignored. So it might be a valid certificate, but if it's marked as being revoked, then any message can be ignored, and that way you can be sure that those devices can no longer be used because of the way the certificate's managed. And then you've got this higher level authority I mentioned. This is a certificate authority, and the certificate authority can act as an additional verifier as a sender's identity. It needs internet access to verify certificate details, or as a minimum you'd need a certificate authority on your wide area network. But the idea here is that when something receives a certificate, it can then verify that certificate with a higher level authority to make sure that it is actually a valid certificate. So it gives you additional layers of protections beyond and above just the certificates themselves. So here's some general guidance for your cybersecurity policy. This isn't full guidance, but certainly following some of these, this becomes the basis of what your policy might look like. So first of all, you need to limit access and allow qualified and trusted users only. And there's an idea of minimum levels of access, so no one should have a greater level of access than they need to do their job. This needs managing, but again, for cybersecurity, this is how it works. So with minimum access, you restrict access until users demonstrate that they need to have access, rather than give everyone everything, because that is a cybersecurity issue. The users themselves need to be vetted, so you would only recruit and employ users that are secure. So that might be looking at people's backgrounds, it might involve some sort of other vetting. And then once that they are vetted, you would then train them in cybersecurity as well as the OT device operation. So it's not enough just for them to be an OT, say PLC or HMI SCADA technician. They need an understanding of what cybersecurity means as well. Of course, you should use secure hardware, and you should use passwords. Using passwords means you have a password policy. Passwords themselves need to be secured, and they should also be changed regularly, but not too regularly. If you enforce too often changes of passwords, then your users will just reuse passwords or write them down on the post-it note and stick them on the item. It needs to be regular enough so that it's not too frequent, but regular enough that any attacks only have a limited window of time. So typically changing passwords every 6 months is appropriate, not more than that, and maybe as little as once every year, but not too frequently, but not too infrequently. And they need to be secured. So it might be that you use a password manager, or it might be that users themselves have some sort of security that they use to make sure their passwords are not exposed. And passwords should not be shared. Each user should have their own unique password as well as their own unique username depending on the systems they're accessing. Ideally, you would integrate systems to minimize the number of passwords to be remembered. But again, the more shared passwords you have between different systems, then the more exposed you are from a cybersecurity attack. So again, there's a trade-off here, and this is important with security. The more secure you make something, the harder it is to manage. The easier you make it to manage, potentially the less secure it is. Now you need to update your device firmware regularly, and especially if required due to cybersecurity updates. So the way you can monitor that is by using the vendor's information to see what firmware updates are released, and if there's any information about cybersecurity updates, they should be treated as critical updates that need to be installed as soon as possible. Again, there's a trade-off here, because if you install too many firmware updates, then you might be affecting plant availability. But equally, if you don't install them enough, then you have a cybersecurity risk, and if there is an attack, then of course that itself could affect your availability. Now, physical protection is required. This can include locking cabinets. So instead of maybe a simple handle on the cabinet to allow opening, you might want a key, and the level of key and the security there, again, that will depend on what your policy says. It's also important to restrict user access to sites. I've been to some sites where you could just walk in, very insecure, and some sites where you needed an escort and you needed to have special vetting and you need to do training courses and you maybe need to have all sorts of issues before you could access site. So again, it's a trade-off between the amount of protection, the ease of use, and the cybersecurity you implement. Now, physical security is one thing, but these days more and more network traffic is going over the internet or wide area networks, so secure protocols are required. Again, OPCUA, MQTT, implement the security, and failing that, implement VPNs so that you can have secure networks. A good idea is to segment IT and OT networks. Now, they can either be segmented physically using separate physical networks, or you could use the same network cables and use VLANs. So VLANs can be implemented via various network switches. And the idea of VLAN is it segregates the network even if it's on the same traffic, and it can encrypt it to make sure that the individual networks cannot be compromised by having access to the other network. Now, my view is that plant or process control networks should not have direct internet access, although some people use this because they want remote access. Maybe they want reporting, maybe you need access to some sort of web server or some other idea, but wherever possible, plant and process control networks should be segregated as far as possible. If you do need remote access, then use a VPN. So again, variety of ways of implementing VPNs. That could be a software process running on a computer, or there are physical VPN devices that you can also access. But one point about VPNs is they do need managing. So things like certificates need upgrading. They may have passwords that need modifying. And if it's a physical device, that may need firmware upgrades. So again, there's another layer of management required here as you add more and more security. On the OT network itself, my recommendation is to segment the controller, I/O and safety networks, partly for operational reasons and safety reasons, but also again to eliminate that possibility of people being able to compromise one network by accessing another network. You can monitor networks for unauthorized access, and this is where an IPS or an IDS comes in. So an intrusion detection system can detect unauthorized access, and an intrusion protection system can even remove those messages from the actual network. Now, they need a lot of management, and typically today you don't implement an IDS or an IPS as a product. It's normally implemented as a service, and there is some outside company that actually manages that for you. Your cybersecurity people, your IT people would be aware of what's going on, but someone else is actually doing all of the monitoring, maybe using AI techniques and so on to make sure that your network is not compromised. What you also need to do is perform cybersecurity audits. You need to keep going back to your policy. Does my policy still make sense given current arrangements? And you need an intrusion response policy as well. What happens if there is an attack? And this is very important on the OT side as well as the IT side. Has something been compromised? If I've been attacked, does that mean that my PLCs are still doing what they should be doing? Is my HMI SCADA still controlling my plant in the way that it was originally intended to? And if you're not sure, then you need to maybe wipe all of your systems and reinstall your backups. So that's where your secure backups come in. And this is what happens in a lot of ransomware attacks. The computers are locked and you either have to pay a ransom to recover them, but then how do you know it's actually recovered? The usual response to ransomware is completely clean the PLCs, reinstall everything from known good images, and then restore from backups. But that can be very expensive and very time consuming, as we've seen in recent cyber attacks. Again, keeping backups, we mentioned this. Why do you do this? Well, partly because of those ransomware attacks, but also in case of hardware failure as well, or in case of obsolete hardware or something else, you need that backup so that you can carry on managing your assets. And if there are old assets, you should dispose of them securely. For example, zimming them, wiping the memory, but possibly even by actually physically shredding the hardware so nothing can be recovered. It's possible those old assets still contain passwords, they might contain other intellectual property, so wiping the memory or securely shredding them is a good way of making sure no one can access that IP or those passwords. So to finish off, let's just talk about what the main types of attack are. We probably should have started with this, but I'm assuming that most cybersecurity professionals will know this, so I put it in at the back here at the backup. But this is why people are performing attacks and what those types of attacks are. So I mentioned denial of service, a DOS, or also a distributed denial of service, DDoS. The purpose of a denial of service attack is to prevent the use of an equipment or service. Now, attackers might be doing this for several reasons. They might be so-called script kiddies or just hackers who are just doing this for fun. They might be people who are doing it to steal resources. They might be doing it for blackmail reasons. There are lots of reasons why people do this. There are even nation-state attacks on other states and on critical infrastructure which are designed to disrupt those countries. So there's a lot of different levels as to why this might happen. Ransomware is normally operated for financial reasons. So the way ransomware works is users are locked out of their system until a ransom is paid. And then what will happen then is the person who performed the ransomware attack, they will then provide a decryption key to allow that user to carry on operating. But as I mentioned on previous slides, if just because you've paid a ransom doesn't mean that the system is going to be okay afterwards. Maybe they will come after you again for more money. Maybe they won't give you the decryption code. Maybe there will be other issues there. And you don't know if the system's compromised if you've actually been able to clean it successfully. Typically with ransomware, the motive is financial, but the only way to be sure that you've got correct operations is to restore all of the operating system and files from known good backups. Vandalism is a possible effect. That's where people want to disable or destroy an equipment or service. And that can be done by attacking operational technology equipment. If you can force a valve to be open when it should be closed, you could potentially cause a vessel to overfill, you could cause an overpressure or an overtemperature, and that could cause damage to the equipment. There's espionage. It might be that someone is looking to steal proprietary information. That might be as simple as, what is your current operational data? How much of something are you doing? Because a spy could potentially use that to see what your level of operations are and how many orders you've got, or how busy are you. Are you in a sort of mode at the moment where you're running flat out? And that could be potentially valuable to someone. Theft is also common, and this involves tricking a user into transferring money or stealing money directly using the user's computer. So again, the motive here is financial, but we often see this on high-level systems. It probably doesn't apply to OT level systems because there is no money in those OT systems, but it is a mode and a motive for particular types of attack. And the final one that also is quite common, but maybe less reported, is co-opting resources for other purposes. So there might be someone out there who's trying to steal part of your computer power, and they're trying to maybe use your computer as a botnet for a spam attack. Maybe they're using it for Bitcoin mining, or maybe there's some other purpose. So they're not out to steal anything other than the resources you have. So some percentage of your computer performance they may be using because it's cheaper for them to do that than it is to actually go out and buy the computers themselves. Now this list isn't exhaustive. In fact, this whole slide deck isn't exhaustive, but certainly as an introduction to cybersecurity and with some particular approaches and some details on PACSystems and Movicon, this will help you to have more secure operations.